Hello and welcome to BYJU'S IAS. Let's take up the analysis of today's The Hindu newspaper. The four convicts in the Nirbhaya case to be hanged on the 22nd of Jan. In 2012, Nirbhaya was brutally gang raped and murdered in the national capital. This horrific incident generated a massive outrage in India and as well as around the world, and it triggered massive protests which brought spotlight to the topic of women's safety, to the topic of outdated and archaic rape laws, and as well as to the topic of juvenile justice. Because one of the perpetrators was a minor and there was a strong demand that he should be tried as an adult. But that was not possible because the then juvenile justice laws of India would not allow a minor below the age of 18 years to be tried as an adult. And this would also go against international conventions and international best practices when it comes to treating juveniles who are in conflict with law. But the massive protests pushed the government of India to thoroughly review these issues, and for this purpose, it established the Justice J.S. Verma Committee. After a thorough review, the Justice J.S. Verma Committee submitted an extensive set of recommendations with the intention of reforming India's rape laws and with the intention of promoting women's safety. Now let us take a brief look at some of the key recommendations of the Justice J.S. Verma Committee. The committee recommended the widening of the definition of rape and sexual assault. It recommended stringent and enhanced punishment for sexual offences. Most of these recommendations were implemented by introducing the Criminal Law Amendment Act of 2013. The Justice J.S. Verma Committee also had recommended to treat marital rape as a criminal offence. But unfortunately, the government is yet to implement this recommendation. The committee also suggested changes to India's juvenile justice laws, and some of these recommendations have been implemented through the Juvenile Justice Act of 2015. Under this legislation, a minor who is in the age group of 16 to 18 years can be tried as an adult for heinous crimes and serious criminal offences. The committee even went beyond its mandate and recommended changes to laws dealing with sexual harassment of women at workplace. It asked the government to cover domestic workers as well in order to prevent their sexual harassment and sexual exploitation at workplace. But unfortunately, this recommendation has also not been implemented. The committee had even suggested a set of police reforms in order to make the police force more effective and sensitive while investigating rape cases. Some of these changes have been reflected by amending the Indian Penal Code and the Indian Evidence Act. The committee had even recommended educational reforms in order to introduce sex education at a young age so that young boys could be sensitized to respect women and to understand the concept of consent. Now coming back to the case, the key accused, Ram Singh, committed suicide while the trial was in progress, and the juvenile was tried according to the then juvenile justice laws, and he served a minimum term at a juvenile justice center and has been subsequently let off. But the trial of the other four accused progressed through various stages of the judiciary, and they were awarded the death penalty. And their death penalty has been upheld by the Supreme Court as well. Recently, these four convicts had filed a review petition, and the review petition has also been rejected by the Supreme Court. So this has set the stage for the execution of these convicts, and as per the existing prison rules, January 22nd has been set as the execution date. Now the only option in front of the convicts is to file a curative petition at the Supreme Court or to seek a presidential pardon under the extraordinary powers enjoyed by the President under the provisions of Article 72. See, the Supreme Court can review its own judgment according to the powers of the Supreme Court under Article 137. According to Article 137, the Supreme Court can review all its judgments, provided if it doesn't go against any laws made by the Parliament or against any rules set by the Supreme Court itself under Article 145 of the Indian Constitution. So, subject to the laws of the Parliament and the rules made by the Supreme Court under Article 145, the Supreme Court can review all its judgments according to Article 137. This provision has been provided in order to provide an opportunity for the Supreme Court to prevent any gross miscarriage of justice and to correct any apparent error that might have crept in during the trial process. So accordingly, review petition has been included under the Civil Procedure Code for civil cases, and in case of criminal offences, review petition is accepted by the Supreme Court only in rare and exceptional circumstances. So in the Nirbhaya case, the review petition was accepted, but later the Supreme Court rejected the review petition. Now, the final judicial option that the convicts have is to file a curative petition in front of the Supreme Court. A curative petition is considered as a last resort and the last available judicial option to review the judgment of the Supreme Court. This judicial concept was evolved by the Supreme Court in the 2002 Rupa Ashok Hurra case, and it also draws inspiration from Article 137 of the Indian Constitution. The curative petition was evolved by the Supreme Court as the last judicial option to prevent any gross miscarriage of justice and to correct any apparent error. But the Supreme Court will accept the curative petition only if the petitioners are able to prove that principles of natural justice has been violated in this case. And once they exhaust the curative petition, the only remaining option would be to seek a presidential pardon under Article 72. Now let's take up the next article. The Government of India has sent out invites to foreign diplomats who are based out of New Delhi to visit Kashmir. Ever since the provisions of Article 370 was revoked in August, Kashmir has been placed under a communication lockdown and politicians continue to remain under detention. These harsh measures of the Indian government invited criticism from Western governments and the Western media. One of the major points of criticism was that the diplomats of these Western governments were not allowed to visit Kashmir in order to assess the ground situation for themselves. But if you remember, in October we had discussed that the Government of India had allowed a controversial group of members of European Parliament to visit Kashmir. The visit of this group of MPs of the European Parliament turned out to be controversial because all the members belonged to far right-wing political parties of Europe. It had also been alleged that the Government of India had choreographed the entire event by working along with a think tank. It had been said that the Indian government had pre-decided the places that the MEPs would be allowed to visit. It had also been stated that the Indian government had selected a few Sarpanch leaders and few local people who would be allowed to interact with the MEPs. So basically, it was said to be a stage-managed visit or a choreographed visit. During this visit, diplomats of Western governments had expressed displeasure because India had allowed a select group of controversial MEPs to visit Kashmir, whereas the same request had been denied to them. So according to this article, after nearly 5 months of imposing a communication lockdown in Kashmir, India has extended an invite to foreign diplomats based out of Delhi to visit Srinagar. This invitation has been sent out to senior diplomats of European Union countries. It has also been sent out to the diplomats of Gulf countries, to members of the UN Security Council, and as well as to the members of the UNHRC. So on India's part, this is an effort to reach out to the Western governments and the Gulf countries and to allow them to determine the ground situation for themselves. But it has been reported that most of the diplomats are yet to accept this Indian invitation. Especially the European diplomats, they are looking to take a collective decision which would represent the European Union. According to this report, the diplomats will accept the invitation only if India doesn't choreograph the visit and only if India shows flexibility during the visit. Because the diplomats would like to visit a wider set of places and they would like to interact with a wider set of people. They do not want a stage managed event where the places they visit and the people they interact with is tightly controlled by the Indian government. They are seeking this flexibility and wider access in order to determine the ground situation in Kashmir for themselves. So we need to wait and watch as to how the Indian government would respond. Now let's take up an article from page number 9. The Indian Army to implement the GOCO model to improve efficiency. It has been reported that the Army will employ the government-owned contractor operated model or the GOCO model in order to enhance efficiency in its workshops and ordnance depots. This model was recommended by the Lieutenant General D.B. Shekatkar Committee in order to enhance the combat capability of the Indian Army and rebalance its defense expenditure. So in this context, let us understand what the GOCO model is. See, the GOCO model is basically a model of investment. This model initially gained popularity in the United States. And as the name itself suggests, the government owns the infrastructure and the private sector operates the facility. This model of investment basically brings the best of both the worlds together. See, when it comes to initial investment and infrastructure creation that requires capital, the private sector is found to be lacking because the government always has immense resources. It basically has more money, it has deeper pockets. So when it comes to infrastructure creation, it is always easier for the government to fund the project than for the private sector. But the problem with the government is that when it comes to operating that infrastructure or that facility, efficiency tends to get compromised because of bureaucratic delays. Bureaucratic delays and red tapeism is an inherent feature of any hierarchical government. But on the other hand, the private sector has an advantage. Its advantage is that it is not bogged down by bureaucratic delays, and the private sector always strives to achieve operational efficiency. So under this model, the government owns the facility and it allocates the operation of this facility to the private sector in order to enhance operational efficiency and shield it from bureaucratic delays. For example, in the given case over here, the Indian Army will own the workshops, the equipment and the facilities. But the selected private contractor will run the operations by bringing in the required manpower. This model of investment and operation gained a lot of popularity in the United States, especially in the energy sector, the defense sector, and as well as in the R&D sector. It basically helps to shield the operations of the facility and the manpower from the negative influences of the bureaucracy. So this will basically enhance operational efficiency. Now let us take up a column from page number 10, which evaluates the relationship between the idea of democracy and the idea of a nation state. See, a nation state is defined by its geographical boundaries and the demography that it is made up of. Whereas a democracy could exist in different forms. For example, during the freedom struggle, under the Gandhian philosophy, democracy was seen as the implementation of Swaraj or self-rule. Under the Swaraj model, the real power is vested with the local communities and not with a centralized government. But this model of democracy may not be viable in the modern world because it would weaken the concept of the nation state due to the external threats that it faces. Then we had other thinkers such as V.D. Savarkar and various other Islamic scholars who saw democracy through the prism of religion. They advocated an exclusive nation on the basis of religion, and hence V.D. Savarkar came up with the Hindutva ideology, and various Islamic scholars such as Maulana Maududi came up with the concept of an Islamic democracy. Basically, such a state would be a theo-democracy because democracy in such a state is defined or is seen through the prism of religion. Then we had leaders such as Ramaswamy Naikar, K.M. Panikar, and even B.R. Ambedkar, who saw democracy through the prism of caste. We also had tribal leaders who saw democracy through the prism of tribal interests. The writer says that such models of democracy are exclusionary in nature, and such exclusionary models of democracy can weaken the nation state. In this context, the writer praises the constitutional democracy that India adopted after 1947 and 1950. This constitutional democracy embraced India's diversity, and this can be seen from the fact that India's diversity is reflected in India's policy making. According to the writer, the constitutional democracy of India is inclusive in nature, and this is evident from the fact that the policies made by the state reflects the diversity of India. The policies made by the state tries to strike a balance between the diverse interests and demands of various communities of India. He says that it is this model of democracy which has strengthened the Indian nation state. According to him, if India could survive and thrive as a single nation state for so many years, it is because India embraced its diversity by adopting a constitutional democracy which was inclusive in nature. This is where he questions the exclusionary nature of the Citizenship Amendment Act and the proposed NRC, and he labels them as the single biggest threat to the founding principles of India. He says that the exclusionary nature of these policies weakens India's constitutional democracy, and subsequently it weakens the idea of India. According to him, that's the reason why there is a popular upsurge across the country against these exclusionary policies, and it is high time we retrieve the ideas of democracy and nation and re-establish the link between the two. Now let's take up a column from page number 10. See, over the last 1 week, we have discussed about the creation of the post of the Chief of Defence Staff and how it enhances India's defence preparedness and India's combat capability. But in this column, the writer makes a counterpoint. He says that there is a design flaw in the creation of the post of the Chief of Defence Staff, and this erodes civilian supremacy over the defence establishment. See, on the 24th of December, the Government of India notified the creation of a new department known as the Department of Military Affairs, which would be headed by the Chief of Defence Staff. And this department would deal with the armed forces of the Union, that is the Indian Army, the Navy and the Air Force. It would also deal with the integrated headquarters in the Ministry of Defence, which comprises of the respective headquarters of all the three services. And this department would also deal with the Territorial Army. And the Chief of Defence Staff, who has been appointed as the Secretary to the Department of Military Affairs, sits at the top of the defence food chain. The Chief of Defence Staff has been given the powers of procurement except for capital acquisition. He has the responsibility to build jointness and synergy amongst the three armed forces. He also has been given the powers to restructure the existing military commands by establishing joint commands or new military commands. And apart from being the secretary to the Department of Military Affairs, the Chief of Defense Staff will also act as the permanent chairman of the Chief of Staff's committee. Along with this, he will also function as the principal military advisor to the Raksha Mantri. So basically, he will serve as a single point of advice to the government on all military matters. But the notification also says that the three service chiefs will continue to report to the defense minister or the Raksha Mantri in matters related to their respective services. And it has also been clearly stated that the Chief of Defense Staff will not exercise any military command over the service chiefs. According to the writer, this is a critical flaw in the design of the post. Because, on one hand, the government is trying to retain the autonomy of the service chiefs in matters related to their respective services by clearly stating that the CDS has no military command over the service chiefs. But on the other hand, the CDS will exercise some sort of superintendence over the service chiefs because he is also the permanent chairman of the Chief of Staff's committee. So the writer says that even though all the four officers are of the same rank technically, the CDS would still outrank the other three service chiefs because he is the permanent chairman of the Chief of Staff committee. So invariably, all the three service chiefs would be reporting to the Chief of Defense Staff, and this makes his office extremely powerful, which will have the potential to erode civilian supremacy over the defense establishment. Now let's take up a column from page number 11 that has been written by Amitabh Mattu. In this column, the writer refers to the massive bushfires seen in Australia as a human and environmental tragedy that is a direct consequence of climate change. But he says that this tragic event presents an opportunity for India and Australia to collaborate in the field of environment conservation and climate action. Because India being one of the largest consumers of fossil fuels and Australia being one of the largest exporters of coal, both the countries have a lot of common interests with regard to fighting climate change. The writer suggests that both India and Australia could set up a joint scientific task force which could study the link between climate change and the increasing frequency and magnitude of extreme weather events. He is calling upon both the countries to study the impact of burning fossil fuels in driving climate change and these extreme weather events. He says that such a platform could be used by India and Australia to study the promise of cleaner coal technology and as well as to promote the objectives of the International Solar Alliance. He says that India and Australia can work together to develop cleaner and renewable forms of energy which can be a greener alternative to fossil fuels. Since there is already a lot of convergence between the two countries in various domains, it is only logical for India and Australia to collaborate in the field of environment protection and climate action as well. See, over the last 1.5 decades, India and Australia have been working very closely on various foreign policy issues, including strategic issues such as the rising threat of China, the Indo-Pacific strategy, etc. Apart from this, both the countries are collaborating in the field of maritime security as well. They even conduct a joint naval exercise known as AUS Index. Both the countries have close collaboration in the field of cybersecurity and counterterrorism as well. And there is also a lot of goodwill and soft power that is enjoyed and exercised on both the sides. For example, a large number of Indians go to Australia to study and work. Australians, on the other hand, see India as a large market with immense opportunities and also as an exotic tourist destination. So the writer suggests that both India and Australia should work towards converging these commonalities in order to develop a joint strategy towards combating climate change. Now let us take up the practice questions. Targeting cultural sites with military action is considered a war crime under which international law? The correct answer is option A. It is under the 1954 Hague Convention for the protection of cultural property in the event of armed conflict. This question has been asked because we have a related article on page number 14. See, after the United States assassinated Qasem Soleimani, Iran threatened to retaliate against American bases located in Iraq. In response to these threats, Donald Trump had tweeted that the United States would respond to any aggression with complete force and it would not hesitate to target Iran's cultural sites. This tweet of Donald Trump attracted a lot of controversy because targeting cultural sites in military action is considered as a war crime under international law. To be specific, it is considered as a violation of the 1954 Hague Convention for the protection of cultural property in the event of armed conflict. So, in response to this controversy, the Pentagon has clarified that the United States would not be targeting any cultural sites in Iran because any such attack would constitute a violation of international law and it would be treated as a war crime. Now let us take up the second practice question. Which of the following can be considered as applications of genome sequencing? See, genome sequencing is nothing but the process of determining the complete DNA sequence of an organism's genome. Such sequencing will help in determining any defects in the genetic sequence, and it can be used to diagnose any genetic disorders in newborns. It can be used for the development of customized medicine. That is, customized medicine can be developed based on one's specific genetic defects. But this technology cannot be used for curing rare types of cancer caused by genetic factors. The third statement is incorrect. See, genome sequencing can be used to diagnose rare types of cancers which are caused by genetic defects, but it cannot be used to cure such rare types of cancers. So the correct answer is option B, 1 and 2 only. This question has been asked because we have a related article on page number 5. According to the article, the genome sequence of the Indian cobra has been developed. This sequence will help the scientists to develop new antivenoms which will be way more effective than the existing antivenom. Now let us take up the third practice question. The 103rd Amendment to the Constitution of India provides for 10% reservation for economically weaker sections. Option D is the right answer. See, the land boundary agreement to resolve the enclave issue with Bangladesh was implemented through the 100th Constitutional Amendment Act. GST was introduced through the 101st Constitutional Amendment, and the National Commission for Backward Classes was provided constitutional status through the 102nd Constitutional Amendment Act. Whereas recently in 2019, 10% reservation for economically weaker sections was provided through the 103rd Constitutional Amendment Act. This question has been asked because we have a related article on page number 9. According to this article, the Government of India has informed the Supreme Court that it is up to the discretion of the state governments to provide for 10% reservation for the economically weaker sections. This provision was introduced earlier in 2019 through the 103rd Constitutional Amendment Act, which inserted Article 15 Clause 6 and Article 16 Clause 6 to the Indian Constitution. Now let us take up a map-based question. Insurgency hit cities such as Ramadi, Mosul, and Samarra are located in which country? The correct answer is option B, Iraq. Please look at this map. This is where Mosul, Ramadi, and Samarra are located. These cities of Iraq are constantly in news because of insurgency and radicalism in the region. Now let us take up a practice question from the 2016 prelims paper. Who of the following had first deciphered the edicts of Emperor Ashoka? The correct answer is option B, James Prinsep. Finally, let's take up a couple of mains practice questions. The first question, will the post of Chief of Defence Staff bring greater synergy amongst the armed forces or erode civilian supremacy over the armed forces? Discuss. The second question, the massive bushfires seen in Australia is a direct outcome of climate change. How can India and Australia collaborate to counter the effects and prevent a recurrence? So kindly write an answer to these questions and post them in the comment section below. So this concludes our discussion for the day. Thanks for watching.